recently had a meeting with my principal because I have to learn how to discuss controversial topics. Uh, and I want to know how I could discuss racism as two sides, like as a good and a bad.
Mm. I'll let the Doctors Browns tackle that. I have something to say, but I think this is their area.
Go ahead,
Do
Dr.
you
Brown.
can go ahead, Anthony.
So your question is race, how race could be viewed as a good. I mean, this is an interesting question. I think I'm going to use culture as a replacement, just as one example of kind of good and bad. So if we understand race as a social construct, the good, of course, in that, like in terms of an approach, is that you understand that a particular group has been treated, there's been a perception and it's not real, it's a fiction. So there's a relief to know that the assertions that we might have had about each other, the world is in fact flat. Not flat, it's round, right? We are not, so it's a kind of, it's a turn, it's a major turn for many of the students. And that's a good thing. I mean, one of the things I emphasize is that we very early on in age, we present this as early as pre-K. We say to students, we're all the same under the skin, we're under the same race, the human race. But we seem to drop the ball from that period forward. We only say it as a way in which to maybe to manage students, just like we want them to say crisscross applesauce. But from that point forward, we leave it hanging the idea that the things that we put in you at an early age are in fact true. We all are just kind of exterior, have this visual thing, but we all are of the human race. But we don't go far enough into engage it. So, but here's the negative with that. So, and this is a conundrum. So if we say, oh, well, that means if we're all the same, then we don't necessarily have to pay attention to differences. So if we pay attention to differences, we're re-engaging this question that race is real. So in some cases, race, oh no, it's not real, good thing. But to then to say it's not real and then to engage a question to suggest that we're equal, I think is a negative, well, I don't even say negative, but an inaccurate depiction of race as a social construct. So this is where colorblind racism comes in. Dr. Brown, do you want to follow
Yep.
through?
Yes, I was going to ask a question because I want to make sure that I am clear about the question. Is the question about, is your question asking how do we talk about racism, at racism as a bad or good thing, or are you talking about race? Like the practice of segregate, the practice of, um, you know, denying people their humanity based on race.
Actual like racism, because like I was told within the meeting at some parts that this is a very difficult time and we're facing the election and you always have to see both sides. And then I was just like, well, there aren't two sides to racism.
I got you. I got what you. So yeah, so that would be, you know, the way that I would think about that, and the way that Anthony just addressed it. I mean, I think that there's a way to have a conversation about race, and there's a way to have a conversation about people's, you know, understanding about race. Um, and maybe even how they make sense of, first of all, what is racism and how has it perhaps played a role in our society, historically and even in the present. And I don't know what age group you're working with. You could
Ninth
have
grade.
that, ninth graders, right? So you could have a conversation, and I think, you know, students would be, you know, they'll engage. What I would suggest, and this is the way that I talk to my the university students that I work with, that I think would be appropriate, is to first make sure that there's an understanding about what do we mean by racism. Because if we, you know, one of the reasons why I think you have this conversation about, let's talk about both sides, is I'm not exactly sure that people are really clear about what is racism. And so helping them to get some just basic understandings of, here are some definitions about topics. Um, to talk about your own perspectives about race and your experiences with race, it's very different than talking about how institutionally it's operated within our society. And I
Mhm.
think that's one way that you might be able to have more of if they're wanting a balanced conversation, you could have a balanced conversation. I don't know how, to be honest with you, I don't know how to tell you to talk about racism, like the actual, problem with racism as potentially being something that's good, right? You know what I mean? I think it sounds to me like what the challenge is there are people who might have beliefs that maybe they don't believe we still have racism, or maybe
Yeah.
they don't, but right. And so that, I think that kind of question is just, let's actually look at some definitions, and let's try to understand what's happening. And then let's understand what's your own personal experience with it.
Yeah.
And helping them to know that there's a difference between interpersonal racism and institutional and structural racism. And they may be talking about their own personal experiences on one level, but that doesn't negate what happens at the other level. So that's how I would suggest. And I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's how I would probably
No,
approach
that
it.
makes sense. Yeah, that's
Okay, great. Okay.
There's also a comment in the chat from Renee Blackman, and she says, it seems that there should be more about creating a safe environment for students to share rather than there is two sides to examine. And I agree with
Right.
that.
Yes.
Also, I think we need to be very careful about having these binary conversations where there's like a black
Yeah.
and a white, or a right or a wrong, or a good and a bad. I think that our society and the way as we've even seen with these documents, the way our society has been constructed has been messy, and it's been fraught with, with compromise, with challenges, with warfare, all kinds of things. And I think that we need to teach our children that that's part of how this nation came to be. And so if you're thinking about things in just good and bad, that really oversimplifies things a bit too much, I think. And so I think it prepares them for what they're going to read, what they should be reading, but what they'll read as they grow older, depending on what grade they're in and depending on what books they're using. It will prepare them for the realities of American history.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I'll just tack this on to what you just said, Dinah, is that when we think about how race gets constructed in the first place, one of the most powerful ways is through the stories that we tell about race. And when we have those binary stories, or when we have a story that suggests that there's a right, we can actually talk about this as something that's potentially good or bad. Those are stories we tell, right? And that's what keeps some of our misinformation about race and racism continuing to perpetuate.
I agree.
Thank y'all.
Okay, we have a question. Oh, Dr. Anthony Brown nailed from a cultural aspect. Oh, okay. No, there's no question.
It's a comment.
Not sure there's a comment. Okay. So what about other, did anyone have any other insights or things that you're wondering about after looking at those documents? Particularly, or maybe around those examples of the social construction of race or structural racism. Did any groups talk about examples that you found in the documents?
And we recognize too that you guys, some of you probably don't know each other. You might have been put in a room with four or five other people that you've never met. So we recognize that. But we thought it would be a nice way to, by giving you the prompts, an opportunity to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, did anyone happen to find anything?
I had a quick question.
Sure.
I was in group 8, and when we were looking through the documents, it was talking about 3/5 and Native Americans. So my question was, were they counted as 3/5 of a person, and then the taxation? I was just a bit confused about that.
So let me pull up what's happening. I'm trying to pull up the actual clause so I can read that to you. So Native Americans are listed here as Indians. They were not taxed, but the 3/5 was for all other persons, which basically meant enslaved people. So all the other groups were accounted for. Enslaved people were not named, but enslaved people were the ones that were considered 3/5 of a person. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am, it does. Okay,
Okay.
because I was wondering, I was like, I hope this isn't a stupid question if they're counted as 3/5
There's
of a
no
person.
such thing. And I mean, it says, excluding Indians, not taxed. So they're not taxed. and then 3/5 of all other persons. And that's how the representation was going to be for enslaved people. Let me just give a quick background though. When you look at colonial records, and even into the 19th century, when you look at the enslavers' documents, they kept estate inventories of their property. And that included silver and bells, I mean, and feather beds and china and enslaved people and cattle, and all listed. And you probably, if some of you have seen this, they're all listed in the same place. They had to keep that because they were being taxed on the property that they own. And this is why the debate was so fraught, because for this, now they're looking at something that they're considered property, and now they're talking about them in terms of people. And that's why there's this discussion. But there had always been an inventory where they were keeping track of the enslaved people that they had as property so they could be taxed accordingly. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am, it does. And our follow-up question to that was, did that include indentured servitude?
Ooh, good question. That's a very good question. I think indentured servants were, depending on where their indenture was, in terms of whether they had worked out their time, they were considered, because they were considered not taxable, but they were considered, they were part of the representation. They were included in representation, whereas these other groups were excluded.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I agree with that. If I could just chime in really quickly, I feel that a lot of times in our classrooms, when we have these binary conversations, that it changes the narrative of what we're actually trying to educate our students. So when we're looking at, you know, the good and the bad in this topic, that good conversation really changes the narrative, and it changes the thoughts and ideas of the students in ways that maybe we're not anticipating. And I just think that having that double-edged sword there about, you know, why these things are bad, but it's also a good thing, because it just changes that narrative, and it confuses our students, and it makes them unsure of how they feel or what they should believe. So I think that, you know, sticking to the documents, of course, having a source that we are looking at, maybe teaching using the source as opposed to just Socratic seminars or conversations in the classroom, that as teachers, we really need to be looking at these documents. And I feel that we should teach our students from the documents so that they are able to capture the narrative. Because if we're just having conversations, whether they're structured or whatnot, but it really changes the narrative for those students. And it's hard for them, especially I have middle school students, and it's hard for them to put those pieces together and create understanding from them. So we really leave the conversation a lot with more questions than we had than when we began, which you know, which is kind of, again, this double-edged sword. It's a good thing, and it's also, you know, not such a good thing, because a lot of our students are leaving with questions, and they're questions about their importance. There are questions about, you know, true or false, what is correct, what's not correct, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so I think that if we drive our instruction with a source, with a reliable source, then we can try to negate some of that confusion.
I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Red.
Oh no, I was just going to say thank you, because I think that's how we should be teaching history. Because even as a historian, we all have our own ways of interpreting a source. We have our own ways of interpreting the past. But when we want to understand what people thought, how people felt, how people interacted with one another, when we read the documents let them speak for themselves, it's more telling and it's more powerful. And I've done that at the college level, where I taught an entire African American history course from Africa, freedom in Africa, up until today, with just primary documents. And I feel like that semester was the most powerful semester I've ever had, because the students saw things that I've been trying to teach for year and year and year and year after year, and they didn't get it. But when they saw the documents, it just clicked in a way that was very powerful. So there needs to be more resources for you all, though, at where you have access to these records. And the Doctors Brown and I are trying to work with the textbook industry and making some changes in that way.
Just to add, I mean, I know I don't want to. We have very little time, so I just want to. One of the things that I try and emphasize, even in my methods class for my secondary to be pre-service teachers, to be teachers, is the idea is having thesis-driven courses. So try and just as the same way we would want to teach the War of 1812, and there'd be particular ideas or particular trajectory of the unit. You want to teach race as a body of knowledge with a body of literature, with particular historians and scholars that are going to help to support the argument, rather than it just being this polemics, which I think sometimes we often do. It is a content area that has information, and oftentimes when you engage it with this kind of thesis-driven approach, with the idea that we're trying to answer a particular question, rather than just it being controversial. Not that it's not controversial, but you set it up in such a way that it's no different than trying to understand World War II.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's part of one of the challenges is that when we talk about race and racism, unfortunately, we talk about it in ways, when we think about the social construction of race, it really has taken on this, it's sort of the appeal where one thinks they understand race. And you do, I mean, if you've experienced it, but then it becomes just an opinion. And what we're sort of arguing is that we talk about it like it is important knowledge, and we have history to sort of support that, and we can find it even in our documents, right? We can find it in records. Yes, someone was going to say something, I think.
Yes, I teach 7th grade, and I teach of course Texas history, but I always connect Spain, of course. I connect the Mexican Constitution, the Texas Constitution, the US Constitution. And I explained to them how the race came about and the mixture, and they're very open. In my school, I have, of course, African American kids, Hispanic, and also white culture, but I also have students that are from Mexico. And when they see that connection between Spain and Mexico and Texas and the US constitutions, all constitutions, they're like, "Oh, okay, I understand." And they're very open to talk about racism. And to me, and I think that's very important to have all those documents, because I do teach all three of them and how they connect to the US Constitution,
Hmm.
because they're kind of borrowed. The Mexican Constitution and Texas Constitution borrowed from the U.S. Constitution. They're very open to that.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that.
I just added a chat. I wasn't sure if you were familiar, a project that Dr. Brown and Dr. Berry and I engaged in through Humanities Texas, and there's a resource there. It's Teaching Slavery, and you'll see the link. Well, actually, I put it in the private, so let me put it. I don't know why.
I
Yeah,
think can I,
everyone,
while you're putting that up, I want to acknowledge this wonderful point. I think it's a very wonderful, keen insight from Renee Blackman. Why do we start discussions about race, considering them to be controversial when teaching about wars and a whole manner of other aspects of our nation's history? It's not seen as controversial. And what I would say to that is because it has historically been positioned as being controversial. And a lot of that has to do with those larger narratives within society and who's talking about them and who's not talking about them. And so I think that's a wonderful
What I'm
question.
saying is I'm thinking that would be a good way to start the discussion
Absolutely.
with students, is to say,
Absolutely.
why do we think this is still why do we think this is controversial when we studied colonization and we weren't talking about it, or when I'm thinking about a principal saying, well, you got to be careful how you do. Well, then let's just put it out there with the kids and go, why does everybody think this is controversial? And then you'll really start to get to the heart of, hey, because it's still affecting us. We're still dealing with it. We're scared. Who knows what things they'll share? And maybe that starts to break down some of the barriers about us having some discussions and some an honest look at this in our class, instead of bringing with us our baggage where someone else was talking about kids who don't even want to, think that this is still something I need to study or something I need to consider.
Thank you for sharing that, Renee. I think that's a wonderful, we need to remember that point when we're in the classroom. Elizabeth Swoops, a few things have come through the chat that I may have missed, but this is a wonderful, well, I think it's an important idea, finding just the right source to correctly portray the idea that I want the students to be able to identify or be able to see can sometimes be challenging. And so do you have anything to offer, Dinah, in that regard? Because there are places we can find sites.
Yeah, I mean, it
that we can
depends. There are some sites. There are great sites. If you look at our website, Teaching Texas Slavery, we do have a list of resources there. And it's not just Texas, because we do have, there's resources on slavery in the North, People Not Property. Great website that I think is great for understanding the American Revolutionary period and understanding slavery as a whole, not just Texas slavery. I think it's a matter of some textbooks. If you look at some of the college level textbooks, they have a document section there that would give you some ideas. But when the educator that was talking about constitutions, it reminded me of John Brown, who had a constitution when he led the raid on Harper's Ferry. So even showing what would his constitution include based on the official constitution. There's just a number of other documents that you may or may not be aware of. But I think maybe we can work with, and I'm just putting this out there. So sometimes if you build it, it will come. Maybe we can work with Humanities Texas, and they do, most of what they do with their workshops are about documents. But maybe there needs to be some sessions just around documents, period. Just collecting and maybe sharing, because teachers may need to share with other teachers about what they're using, what works, what doesn't work. And maybe there's a way to pull that together, particularly those that are teaching the same time period. So
Wouldn't
I know
that be awesome?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
What I was going to say, it would be awesome if each person had one document that they love about that topic that they use and they were able to share it
That would
and
be
how they use it. Yeah.
Exactly. I think we are out of time.